Iran's ally Bashar al-Assad has fallen in Syria. Many are wondering, is this the end of Iran as a regional power? Well, we confidently say that it is not. Based on a prophecy in your Bible that we'll get into in a few minutes, we've been forecasting a shift in Iran's alliances for years. We said they would lose Gaza and Lebanon and Syria, and now they have. But losing these areas is causing Iran to shift focus. One country that is coming into their sights is Egypt. And there was some important developments on this week. And Mihailo Zekic is going to tell us more about it.
Yes, on Wednesday, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian arrived in Egypt for an economic summit that happened Thursday. This is a big deal. This is the first time an Iranian president has visited Egypt since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Mohamed Morsi in 2013. Now, Morsi, of course, was the Islamist president that sat in between the two.
Right, very different from Egypt's current leadership.
Yeah, normally Egypt and Iran don't like each other and haven't liked each other for decades since Iran was implicated in assassinating Anwar Sadat, to the point where Iran does not have an embassy in Cairo and vice versa, of course, until for the longest time Iranian tourists weren't even able to visit Egypt. And now we're actually seeing the president, in this case a reformist, so-called moderate president, visit Egypt under Fattah Abdel al-Sisi, the military regime that started hostilities, you could say, with Iran in the first place. The particular summit they were at was they call it the D8, or like the 8 developing economies of the Muslim world. Pezeshkian wasn't the only a world leader there, but it was a summit between Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Nigeria. You know, look at that list of these major economies of the Muslim world. And there's
no Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, no Saudi Arabia. There's a few important, not just them, but no United Arab Emirates, no Bahrain, no Kuwait, no Qatar, no Jordan. All these normally the movers and shakers of the economies of the Muslim world, they're not invited. Instead, it's these countries that more or less are against them. What exactly Sisi is trying to do with inviting all these people? He has flip-flopped a little bit between the Western camp, which Saudi Arabia and most of these other groups belong to, and Iran and its allies. Egypt, as we've discussed on this program before, we have a whole segment on it from a few months back, is pretty strapped for cash, and I think they're just going to go with whoever is offering them the biggest tidbit. But even with that, regardless, you think about everything as you just mentioned earlier. Hamas is vanquished. Egypt doesn't like Hamas. They're affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is backpedaling. Egypt and Israel have pretty close links. If for nothing else, they need each other to protect each other's security. And for Egypt to go out of its way to invite the Iranian president this way, certainly shows, at the very least, the leadership in Cairo doesn't really care who it's allied to, and at most it may show that it's not the friend of Israel it likes to portray itself as, or at least on the diplomatic front. For this part, Mohammed Hossein Soltanifar, who is, I guess you could say, the highest level diplomatic representative of Iran in Egypt, said that this visit is, quote, would mark a final step towards upgrading bilateral relations to the embassy level, end quote. Whether that's official policy from his perspective or just him saying things he's thinking out loud, we'll have to wait and see. But if we can take him at his word, this means that Iran and Egypt are very, very close to opening full diplomatic relations. And if they're doing things like this, there's no reason why they wouldn't.
And this is so symbolic that you have Iran getting ready to open an embassy in Egypt at the same time as you have Germany and France starting to get their embassies ready for opening in Damascus. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the shift in the Middle East we've been talking about for years, which we'll get to that in just a moment. I just wanted to, we talked, like you said, we talked about Egypt a few months ago. Back then, we talked about how Egypt was desperate for cash for a couple of reasons. One is that they import a whole lot of grain to feed all of their people with this very heavily subsidized grain, whether it's loaves for something like 2.5 cents. they've been having a really hard time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, getting enough grain, and then also that they're building this massive fancy new city in the middle of the desert, which they cannot afford to be building. Do you know, is there any update on Egypt's financial situation since we last talked?
Nothing too major, but it's more of the same.
Like they haven't solved the problem. They're still short of cash. I mean, historically they've looked to Saudi Arabia, they've looked to the United States. I do wonder whether part of this meeting comes to do with Donald Trump returning to the White House, and he's not as keen on handing over US dollars to foreign countries, which you can understand, but also that's going to be a massive concern to Egypt if they're thinking, well, we might not be getting the handouts from the United States that we're used to. Maybe we can get some handouts from Iran instead.
Potentially. I mean, Trump, for his part, had a pretty good relationship with Sisi. I mean, he's a transactional man, and Sisi, obviously, he doesn't really care too much about diplomatic niceties or like liberal causes like human rights per se. So he was somebody that Trump felt he could make a deal with. I think more of the tug is coming from the Gulf states because they've been, for most of the last few years, Sisi's main source for money, and they're getting a little bit fed up for constantly sending buckets of money over and not really getting anything in return. That's why Egypt's trying to experiment with some economic developments, like a resort city on the Mediterranean coast. They're popping out of nowhere in hopes of getting like some kind of business opportunities to, say, make the Emirates a little bit more excited to stay in the foot. The other thing to mention, though, is with the Muslim Brotherhood, as I mentioned, they still have that legacy with Morsi. They have connections with Hamas. Turkey is also a very big sponsor of them. And some people suspect that maybe these kinds of outreaches are Sisi's ways of trying to make the Muslim Brotherhood's paymasters a little bit more happy. And then in turn, maybe they wouldn't be like prodding them as much to cause problems, which could very well be part of the equation. Egypt, for its part, also with Iran at the beginning of this year, joined the BRICS bloc. That doesn't necessarily mean they're friends. China and India are also members of the bloc, and they're constantly skirmishing. Ethiopia joined at the same time, and Egypt threatened war against them. But at the same time, you do see Egypt is recognizing it is in a very bad spot, and it can't really put all its eggs in one basket, so to speak, if it wants to stay afloat with all these myriads of crises hitting it from all sides.
And then from Iran's point of view, Iran has a strategy that you can see already about sea gates, sea lanes, threatening trade. You know, they've gotten a huge amount from their alliance with the Houthis. They've caused global disruption, I should say, by giving the Houthis weapons, having them shoot at ships coming through the Red Sea, through Lebanon, through Syria. They have had a presence in the Mediterranean. They've used that. They've made threats against Europe, saying, well, we'll threaten you in the Mediterranean if you cross us. They've lost that. Egypt gives them an even more critical sea gate on the Red Sea and access to the Mediterranean. So now we're seeing Iran thwarted in one direction, turning towards Egypt. And that is something that we have forecast based on Bible prophecy for years.
Indeed. The pertinent prophecy for that is Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 43. Verse 40 brings out two end-time blocks, a king of the north and the king of the south, which since the 1990s, 1993, I believe, is when Mr. Gerald Fleury got more dogmatic about this, was when he said that you can expect the king of the south to be an Islamist bloc led by Iran, and the king of the north to be Europe working through its various allies in the Middle East to counter Iran. And you keep reading the passage, and it discusses some of these countries that will also get conquered by the king of the north, implying they're allied with the king of the south. And a few countries I mentioned, top of the list is Egypt, that, the land of Egypt shall not escape, verse 42, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, going into the next verse. Egypt is mentioned more than the king of the south actually is in that passage. And not only that, but it's mentioned as having, gold and silver and precious things, treasure. Egypt is considered prophetically a huge integral part of this alliance. You mentioned the Houthis and some of the destruction they're causing. Egypt, of course, is the country that bears the brunt of most of that chaos they're causing, not because they need the shipping to drop off goods, but because they get the revenue from all those ships transiting through the Suez Canal. And Egypt reaching out to Iran this way, maybe their way of coming to Iran and saying you're hurting us really badly. I mean, they know that Iran's the paymasters of the Houthis. This might be Egypt out of desperation offering an olive branch saying we can reconcile if you just stop hurting us this way. That doesn't mean we necessarily expect Sisi to be the one to join the Iranian camp. He very well could, but there's also a huge Islamist contingent in Egypt, which and Sisi and his regime are the main thing they want to stage a revolution against. And ideologically, they're closest with Iran. That's what we saw when Morsi and his people were in power over a decade ago. So as we discussed on that program from months ago, we could definitely see something happening where a revolution happens and Sisi is taken out of the equation. But the general trend, this is what Mr. Fleury wrote in his book, The King of the South, commentating on those verses I just read, quote, Egypt will be conquered or controlled by the King of the North. This clearly implies that Egypt will be allied with the King of the South. This prophecy indicates we are about to see a far-reaching change in Egyptian politics. We have been saying since 1994 that this would occur. Look at Egypt today and you see the nation's foreign policy and political orientation changing in a way that threatens to transform the entire region, end quote. You say that in 1994, if you looked just on the facts on the ground, nobody would have been able to come to that conclusion. Egypt was under a much more stronger position under Hosni Mubarak back then. It was a friend of America, friend of Israel. Again, I would say for the longest time, Iranians couldn't even visit Egypt until just a couple years ago, I believe. And now we're exactly seeing that shift with Egypt growing closer to Iran. As Iran is losing some of these other proxies, there's still a lot of twists and turns, obviously. We can't necessarily see all the details on how everything is going to play out, but we're seeing this prophecy that Mr. Fleury has been focusing on, as he wrote since 1994, about to be fulfilled. If people would like to get a little more context, including as to why this would impact the rest of the world and what it matters for the rest of the world. We have a trends article on our website, Why the Trumpet Watches Iran Allying with Egypt, that goes through a bit of the backstory and a bit more of the prophetic focus on what we're looking for and how it's happening right now.